Just curious, what device are you watching on? Phone, TV, laptop? Comment below.
I remember the exact moment I found out. It was a Monday morning, cold, gray, the kind of morning where the coffee tastes like burnt rubber and the emails pile up like someone's personal vendetta against your peace. I was scrolling through Instagram, half awake, just killing time before logging into a Zoom meeting I didn't care about, when I saw it. A group photo, sunset in the background, leaves around their necks. Everyone grinning like idiots in matching red and green Hawaiian shirts. My parents were there. My sister Megan was there. Her husband Tom, their 2 kids, even our cousin Rick, who usually can't afford gas money to get across town, was there. And then it hit me, slowly, like a stomach cramp from bad sushi. I wasn't there because I wasn't invited. Now, let me give you context. Because without it, this might sound like a simple oversight. I'm Rachel. I'm 45. No kids, never married. I work in legal ops for a mid-sized firm, and I own a house. Actually, I own 2 houses, one of which I let my sister live in, rent-free, because a few years ago she and her husband hit a rough patch and asked for a little time to get back on their feet. I never charged them a penny, not once. I even paid the property taxes myself like a damn fool. So when I saw that photo, when I realized they'd all flown to freaking Hawaii for Christmas without even telling me, without even mentioning it, it felt like someone had reached down my throat and yanked out my dignity by the roots. The comments under the photo were full of holiday cheer. Merry Christmas from paradise. Family is everything. Grateful for time with loved ones. I stared at those words like they were barbs aimed straight at me. Family is everything? Really? Everything except me, apparently. I didn't say anything that first day. Not a word. I didn't call, didn't text, didn't even like the photo. I just stared at it over and over, like maybe if I looked hard enough, I'd see some evidence that it was a joke or a last-minute trip or, God forbid, a technical mistake and someone had simply forgotten to call me. But as more photos came in, boat rides, luau dinners, poolside cocktails, it became painfully obvious. This wasn't an accident. It was a full-blown conspiracy, planned weeks or months in advance, and no one had bothered to even let me know it was happening. 2 days later, the truth came out in the worst way possible. My Aunt Janice, who lives in Florida and has never had a filter in her life, called me to wish me a Merry Christmas. "It's just awful you couldn't make it to Hawaii," she said. I froze. My mouth went dry. I asked her what she meant. She said, "Well, I just figured maybe work got in the way or something, but Megan said you didn't feel like traveling this year." There it was, the lie. Megan told them I didn't want to go. That's when something inside me snapped. Not loudly, not with a scream or a rage-filled text or a dramatic Facebook post, but silently, quietly, like a pressure valve turning the wrong way. I sat down, right there on the kitchen floor, and just stared out the window at the frost-covered lawn behind my condo. I'd spent the last decade trying to keep peace in a family that never bothered to return the favor. I'd missed birthdays and anniversaries and dinners to be there for Megan when she needed help with the kids, or the mortgage, or her mental breakdowns. And here she was, lying to the whole family, making me look like I'd chosen isolation. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not just the exclusion, but the rewriting of the story. They made me the villain in a play I didn't even know was being performed. At that moment, I decided I wouldn't confront her. Not right away. I wouldn't yell or cry or demand apologies. That's what they'd expect, and frankly, it's what they'd be prepared to ignore. Megan was always good at spinning things in her favor. Always the dramatic one. Always the poor, stressed mom, who everyone bent over backward to accommodate. I wasn't going to play that game. Instead, I started remembering details, painful, petty little details that I had always brushed off in the name of keeping peace. Like how Megan had asked me not to come to her daughter's 4th birthday party because she didn't want extra tension. Or how she once told our parents I was probably too busy to help when they needed rides to the doctor, even though she never asked. Or how last Thanksgiving, she arranged dinner an hour earlier and told everyone else, but me. That one hurt. I showed up with pumpkin pie and no place setting. She said it was a last-minute change. I believed her, but now I knew better. I started thinking about the house, the one she lived in, my house. It wasn't just a property, it was leverage. I'd signed the title, I paid the taxes. She lived there out of my generosity, which clearly had an expiration date I hadn't realized until now. So I started making a plan. Not for revenge exactly, but for clarity. If Megan wanted me out of her life, then maybe I'd finally give her exactly what she wanted. A clean break, no strings, no more sisterly support. Just reality, cold, hard, unavoidable. Before I closed my laptop that night, I typed 3 words into Google, change house locks. And I smiled, not because I was happy, not because I was proud, but because for the first time in a long time, I felt something better than peace. I felt power. But here's the question I can't stop turning over in my mind, and maybe you can answer it. If someone pushes you out of the family circle and slams the door behind you, are you wrong for locking the other door they forgot you still owned? Tell me what you think. Because I'm just getting started. There's something uniquely insulting about being forgotten by the very people you never forgot. Not once, not in your worst moments, not even when you had every reason to. After the gut punch of that Hawaiian Christmas hit me square in the chest, I didn't react the way I might have in my younger years, when I still held out hope that speaking up would change anything. No, this time I didn't make a scene, didn't call Megan demanding answers, didn't send a bitter message to our parents, or even drop a passive-aggressive comment under one of their sun-drenched Instagram photos. I did what any woman who's been silently collecting years of quiet disrespect and family gaslighting would do. I got in my car and drove to the house that I own, the house my sister calls home. The drive there wasn't dramatic or stormy or symbolic. It was just an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, dry roads, some late December sunlight bouncing off the frozen grass. I didn't even feel anger in the usual sense. What I felt was closer to clarity, the kind of emotionless realization you experience when you finally take your hands off a thing you've been gripping too tightly for too long. I parked across the street like a stranger and just sat there for a while, staring at the pale blue siding, the neatly trimmed hedges, the wreath Megan had hung on the front door, perfectly symmetrical, red and gold ribbon, like it belonged in a catalog. The irony, of course, is that the house itself had once been my Aunt June's, who had no children and always said I was the only one who visited her without needing something. She left the place to me outright, no stipulations, no et, and I, like a fool who believed in family above fairness, offered it to Megan during their rough patch, which, incidentally, turned into a 5-year stretch of unpaid living with 0 timelines, 0 rent, and a growing list of assumptions. I stepped onto the porch, pulled the spare key from under the ceramic frog Megan thought I didn't know about, and opened the door. The warmth hit me immediately, a rush of heated air smelling like pine and some kind of cinnamon candle, and for a second I almost turned around, like I was intruding on someone else's life. But then I reminded myself, this wasn't just someone else's house. This was my house, my name on the deed, my responsibility when the water heater broke, my name on the tax bill that arrives every March. Yet somehow, somewhere along the line, Megan and Tom had stopped treating it like a generous gift and started acting like it was theirs by right, as if they'd earned it through sheer proximity and smug entitlement. I walked slowly, absorbing the little details, every throw pillow, every photo frame, every item in its curated place. There was a smug orderliness to it all. Megan had always been good at projecting an image of stability and warmth, even when the truth was a whole lot colder. The kitchen was spotless. Stainless steel appliances gleamed. On the fridge, a chore chart for the kids, a shopping list written in Megan's perfect cursive, a Christmas card from a neighbor I didn't recognize. No trace of me, not a single photo, not a single keepsake from the life we used to share. I was a ghost in a house I legally owned. And that's when it really sank in. Not just that they'd excluded me, but that they had done it while standing on the very ground I gave them. They had erased me from the narrative inside the house as much as they had outside of it. And if I'm being honest, it wasn't the Hawaii trip that broke me. It was that erasure, that slow and silent rewriting of our shared history, where I'd gone from older sister and landlord and emotional anchor to some kind of peripheral character they could edit out when it suited them. I stood in the doorway of what used to be the guest room, my room, back when I used to crash here on Christmas Eve so I could watch the kids open their presents in the morning, and I noticed that even the sheets had changed. No sign I'd ever been there, no corner untouched by Megan's curated version of domestic perfection. And maybe that's when it all crystallized, the cold certainty settling into my bones. They'd made a decision, and now it was my turn. I didn't take anything. I didn't touch a single item that didn't belong to me, but I walked out with a firm grip on my next move. The locksmith's card was in my wallet, and as I sat back in my car, I took it out and stared at it like it was a playing card I hadn't realized was the trump. I remembered how Megan once told our parents that I had boundary issues because I showed up unannounced to drop off a new smoke detector when theirs was recalled. She said I was too involved, too intense, that I made her feel watched. Funny how people cry about boundaries right up until the moment they need you to pay their bills. I called the locksmith the next morning. I didn't explain myself. I didn't tell a sob story. I gave him the address, scheduled the visit, and when he asked if I had proof of ownership, I sent him a scan of the title with my name in bold letters. No drama, no hesitation, just paperwork. And as I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not grief, but peace, cold and steady like winter air in your lungs after too long in a crowded room. Because for once, I wasn't going to ask for space. I wasn't going to beg to be seen. I was going to take back what was mine, quietly, legally, completely. And they wouldn't see it coming. The locksmith arrived precisely at 10 in the morning on a crisp, sunlit Thursday that somehow felt cleaner, lighter, as if the very air around me understood that something long overdue was finally being set right. I greeted him with a calmness that didn't match the storm I carried inside, because by that point, I wasn't acting on impulse or emotion anymore, but on a quiet, deliberate sense of justice that had been building, brick by brick, for years. The man was polite, older, maybe in his 60s. The kind of guy who looked like he'd seen every kind of family mess, but didn't ask questions, didn't raise eyebrows, just nodded and got to work with a kind of quiet dignity that made me feel, oddly enough, respected. As I handed him the deed with my name in clear block letters and walked him to the front door of my own house, my house that someone else was living in as if it were their God-given right, I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger or satisfaction exactly, but a strange kind of stillness. The way you feel when you finally let go of the weight you didn't even realize you were dragging behind you. It took less than 30 minutes. One by one, the locks clicked out of their old configurations and were replaced with fresh cylinders, new keys, a clean slate, and physical form. I watched as he replaced the deadbolt I bought myself at Home Depot 5 years ago. When Tom told me the old one was a little sticky, and then never lifted a finger to fix it, I remembered how Megan had once offhandedly told someone that I was kind of a control freak about the house. Like the woman paying taxes and repairs was the unreasonable one in the situation. That memory came and went without much sting anymore. By now, I'd peeled off every layer of justification I'd used to protect them from my own resentment. What was left was simple, unvarnished truth. They'd taken my generosity for granted, dressed it up as obligation, and convinced themselves they owed me nothing in return. Once the job was done, the locksmith handed me a small plastic bag containing the old lock cylinders, as if to say, "Here, this chapter is officially closed." I paid him in cash, tipped him well, and watched him drive away without a word. Then I walked back inside, locked the new door with the new key, and stood in the center of the living room with a silence so thick it felt like insulation. There was no immediate sense of triumph, no cinematic swell of music, no fireworks of revenge, just a slow, satisfying settling of everything falling back into place. I didn't leave a nasty note. I didn't change the Wi-Fi password or shut off the utilities. I didn't even touch their belongings. All I did was write a letter, neatly and in my own handwriting, which I placed in a simple envelope on the foyer table, where Megan would see it the second she opened the door, if she still believed she could walk in whenever she pleased. The letter wasn't long, just a few lines. You made a choice, now I've made mine. Consider the house no longer available to you. Merry Christmas. I left it unsigned. She would know who it came from. The next part happened exactly as I expected, with a precision that bordered on comedic if it hadn't been so painfully predictable. Megan and Tom returned that Saturday evening, just after sundown, probably full of pina coladas and fake tan, expecting to waltz back into the free life they'd become so grotesquely comfortable with. I wasn't there, of course. I'd driven back to my condo and spent the afternoon organizing my spice cabinet and watching old crime documentaries. But I knew exactly what they'd see, and more importantly, what they wouldn't see: access. They wouldn't be able to turn the key. They wouldn't be able to swing the door open and flop onto the couch like conquering heroes. They'd find resistance. They'd find rejection. They'd find reality. By 9 that night, my phone started ringing. First it was Megan, 3 times, then 4, then 7, her name lighting up my screen like a siren. Then Tom tried once, then Megan again. No voicemails, just call after call. I didn't answer. I didn't block them either. I just watched it happen, let the desperation pile up like unpaid rent. It was almost poetic. Around 11, I checked the security camera I'd installed 2 years ago, the one they thought I'd forgotten about. The footage showed Megan on the porch, pacing like a caged animal, wrapped in a puffy jacket and visibly seething. Tom stood behind her holding one of their oversized roller bags. The kids sitting on the front steps, half asleep, bored, unaware of the gravity of the moment. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst. Just quiet, stunned disbelief. They didn't know what to do, and neither did my parents, who must have been alerted immediately. The next call I received came from my mother's number, followed quickly by a text. "Can we talk? Please, Rachel, this isn't like you." That message struck me more than any of Megan's frantic calls, because it was laced with that familiar emotional blackmail, that implication that being calm, decisive, and unshakably done was somehow out of character for me, that the only version of me they respected was the one who swallowed indignity for the sake of keeping the family whole. But this time, I wasn't interested in playing the role. I'd spent years absorbing their discomfort, their pettiness, their constant rearranging of the truth to suit their guilt. And now that I'd finally stopped enabling the fantasy, they wanted a talk. They wanted peace. They wanted resolution. But peace, real peace, comes from acknowledgement, not erasure. And I wasn't ready to forgive silence, especially not the kind that had worn a Hawaiian shirt and sipped Mai Tais while pretending I didn't exist. So I let the calls go unanswered. I made myself a cup of tea, and for the first time in what felt like a decade, I slept like a woman who had nothing left to explain. By the time the 4th day rolled around and Megan's little exile had morphed from awkward inconvenience into full-blown spectacle, I began to understand that my quiet retaliation, my seemingly cold but calculated reclamation of space, had struck a chord far deeper than any shouted argument or emotional breakdown ever could have managed. They weren't just surprised. They were stunned in a way that only people who never expected consequences can be, as if the idea that their actions might lead to real, tangible fallout was completely foreign, like some faraway myth no longer taught in the school of polite family betrayal. What started as a series of unanswered calls had evolved into something almost theatrical, with Megan and Tom setting up what could only be described as a makeshift encampment on the porch of the house they no longer had legal access to, like squatters trying to preserve their claim by sheer force of presence. I hadn't expected them to be so stubborn, so unwilling to admit defeat, even in the face of absolute clarity. There they were, blankets, folding chairs, battery-powered space heaters, a thermos that probably held lukewarm coffee, huddled on the concrete steps as if enduring some kind of noble hardship, all the while ignoring the painfully obvious truth that none of it had to happen if they had simply treated me with a fraction of the consideration they reserved for total strangers. It was bizarre, surreal even. Watching them dig in their heels on a property they didn't own, couldn't enter, and had no legal claim to, yet still refused to acknowledge the choices that led them there. From the camera feed, I watched as Megan performed her suffering for the neighbors, wearing that expression she had perfected over the years, the one that balanced indignation with victimhood so delicately it made people uncomfortable enough to offer help, just to escape the guilt trip she silently broadcasted like a radio frequency. She stood at the edge of the porch, arms folded, jaw tight, occasionally whispering sharply at Tom, who looked increasingly defeated, slouched in a lawn chair like a man who was just now realizing he had tied his wagon to a storm. What broke the quiet symmetry of their silent protest was the arrival of our parents. I'd expected it, of course. There was no way Megan wouldn't drag them into it eventually. I saw their car pull into the driveway just before noon, the familiar navy blue sedan they'd driven since I was in college, the one my dad insisted was still just getting broken in despite its sputtering engine and rusted-out rear-wheel wells. They got out slowly, visibly aged since the last time we'd all been in a room together, which, if I'm being honest, I couldn't even place on a calendar anymore. My mother looked tired before she even opened her mouth. My father looked angry in that clenched, quiet way men of his generation so often do when they're more ashamed than furious and haven't figured out how to say it. They didn't call or knock or text when they arrived. They simply stood at the edge of the porch beside Megan, flanking her like reluctant bodyguards, unsure of what they were defending but determined to stand their ground. My phone rang again. This time I picked up, not because I was ready to talk, but because I needed to see where they were going to take it, how far they were willing to stretch the narrative before it finally snapped under its own weight. My mother's voice came through first, soft, breaking in places, like someone reading a script they didn't write and weren't quite sure they believed. "Rachel," she said, "can we talk? Just talk. No accusations, no fights. We don't understand what's happening here." There it was, the old script, the well-worn plea for peace disguised as concern, as if the breakdown in our family dynamic was some unpredictable weather event, rather than the slow erosion of a foundation they'd refused to reinforce. I let the silence hang just long enough to make them squirm, then replied, "There's nothing confusing about it. You're standing on my porch, talking about misunderstanding, when the only thing you've all been perfectly clear about is that I don't belong." The line went quiet. I could hear shuffling, my father sighing deeply in the background, probably pinching the bridge of his nose like he used to when Megan and I fought over the remote as kids. When he finally spoke, it was with the same tired gravity he reserved for real crises, the ones that couldn't be swept under the rug or placated with a bowl of mashed potatoes and a forced smile. "You've made your point, Rachel, loud and clear, but they have nowhere to go. It's freezing. There are children involved. Whatever your issue is with Megan, let's handle it privately. Don't punish the whole family." That word, punish, stuck in my throat like a splinter. They still saw this as an impulsive act of cruelty, a tantrum, a dramatic overreaction to a simple misunderstanding. They didn't see it as the slow culmination of being pushed out, erased, undermined, and used until I became a convenience instead of a person. They didn't see the pattern, they only saw the response. And like so many times before, they were trying to talk me back into my role, the silent peacemaker, the reliable fixer, the one who absorbed the damage so everyone else could keep pretending nothing was broken. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't even raise my voice. I just said, "They've been living in my house for 5 years. I gave them space, I gave them time, I gave them peace. All I got in return was exclusion and lies. If you're asking me to open the door, you better have a better reason than guilt." My mother cried then, audibly, over the phone, and it didn't sound manipulative. It sounded human. It sounded like the sound someone makes when they realize they've run out of soft words to cover hard truths. I didn't hang up. I didn't relent. I just said, They have money for plane tickets to Hawaii. They can afford a motel. And I ended the call. I watched from my screen as they stood there in stunned silence, still unable to grasp that the locks weren't the punishment. They were the boundary. And for once, I wasn't the one breaking my own rules to make everyone else comfortable. I sat back in my chair, sipping a cup of lukewarm tea that had gone cold while I listened to my parents plead, and I realized I wasn't angry anymore, not in the explosive, chest-thumping way people expect when they imagine revenge, but in a quieter, steadier way, the kind that settles deep in your bones and reminds you that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not open the door. I opened the door not because I was ready to reconcile, nor because I had found it in my heart to forgive, but because after nearly a week of watching my sister camp outside the house I had once gifted her without condition, and after listening to my parents speak to me in tones soaked with guilt and confusion rather than recognition and remorse, I realized there was one final thing left to do, something not born out of vengeance or bitterness, but out of the raw, undeniable need to say aloud the things I had swallowed for far too long, the truths that had sat beneath every forced smile and every Thanksgiving dinner where I pretended that my place at the table wasn't begrudgingly tolerated, but truly desired. It wasn't about closure. It wasn't about peace. It was about finally hearing my own voice in a story that had so consistently erased me. The porch was quiet when I stepped outside. The kind of quiet that comes not from the absence of sound, but from the presence of heavy expectation. Megan was sitting on the top step, her legs tucked underneath her, her hair pulled back in a messy knot that made her look far younger and far more fragile than she had days earlier, when she was still riding high on vacation bliss. Tom was standing by the car, arms crossed, eyes flicking between me and the kids, who were now inside the vehicle, bundled in blankets, and watching something on a tablet, oblivious, or perhaps deliberately distracted from the emotional siege taking place just feet away from them. My parents stood off to the side, not on the porch, not on the lawn, suspended somewhere between loyalty and helplessness, wearing expressions I had seen only once before, when my grandmother died and no one knew how to grieve her properly, because everyone had spent so long pretending she was already gone. No one spoke at first, and that silence wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was powerful, the kind of silence that finally had space to stretch its limbs and be seen for what it really was. Not absence, but presence, the cumulative weight of everything unsaid pressing against the cold air between us. I let it sit there for a moment longer before I finally began to speak, not with fury, not with accusation, but with a calm, unwavering cadence that was more surgical than emotional. I told them that this wasn't about the trip, though it had been the match that lit the fuse. I told them it wasn't about a house, or a key, or a front door, though those things had become symbols of something far deeper, respect, or the lack of it. I explained slowly and deliberately that for years I had watched myself become an afterthought in a family that was supposed to be mine as much as anyone else's, and that the exclusion wasn't just social but structural, rooted in years of decisions made behind my back, explanations offered only when convenient, and apologies crafted not out of remorse but out of the need to restore convenience. Megan didn't interrupt, which surprised me more than anything else. She just stared at me, her eyes wide, wet, but not sobbing, not yet. She looked, for the first time in years, like someone who was listening not because she was waiting for her turn to speak, but because she finally understood that she had run out of turns. I reminded her that I had never asked for repayment, never kept a ledger, never brought up the cost of the furnace I replaced, or the taxes I covered, or the home insurance I paid every year without so much as a thank you text. I told her I did those things because I believed in family, and that belief had become a leash I had quietly tied around my own throat. And then I turned to my parents, who both looked like they had aged 10 years since this began. And I said the one thing I had never dared to say aloud, that they had played favorites, that they had, in their quiet, well-meaning way, enabled a version of family where I was expected to be the adult before I was even out of college, where my reliability was mistaken for resilience, and my silence was mistaken for satisfaction. I told them that I didn't need apologies. Not now, not really, but I needed them to stop pretending this was new, or sudden, or out of character, because the only thing that had changed was that I had finally decided to stop bleeding quietly and had simply placed a bandage where the wound used to be. When I stopped speaking, no one rushed to fill the space. There were no immediate hugs, no tearful reconciliations, no climactic swells of orchestral redemption. What remained was stillness and the sound of a truth that had finally been given shape. Megan finally spoke, voice shaking, barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you cared that much." It wasn't an apology, it was a confession, and maybe it was the first honest thing she'd said to me in years. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw not the sister who had betrayed me, but the woman who had been raised in the same house I was, shaped by the same people who taught us both that asking for space and asking for love were somehow mutually exclusive. And I simply said, "That's because you never bothered to ask." I turned, walked back inside, and closed the door, not in anger, not in triumph, but in finality. I didn't lock it. I didn't bolt it shut. I just let the door close with the weight of 100 conversations that had never happened, and a future I had finally accepted would never look the way I once hoped it would. I don't know what will happen next. I don't know if they'll move on or come back. I don't know if the door will open again, or if it even should. What I do know is this. For once, I am not the one standing outside, waiting to be let in. And maybe that's what justice feels like. Not loud, not cruel, but still, steady, complete. Funny, isn't it? They always said blood is thicker than water, but here I am, warm inside, and they're out there, freezing.